A single typo, one misplaced exclamation mark in the Linux kernel source code. That's all it took to give any local user full root access to your server. This is CVE-2026-23111, a highly reliable use-after-free vulnerability, sitting right now in the nftables firewall subsystem of most major Linux distributions. Why does this matter to you? If you run Docker containers, host virtual machines, or allow any unprivileged users on your system, this flaw lets them break out of their sandbox and take complete control of the host machine. And working exploits are already public. Today we're breaking down exactly how this one character flaw works, why it's so dangerous, and how to patch it. We'll also cover the massive wave of core service updates that hit Samba, OpenSSL, and Apache this week. Welcome back to the channel. Let's get right into the technical details of how a simple inverted check broke Linux security. To understand this exploit, we need to look at nftables. This is the modern packet filtering framework in the Linux kernel that replaced IP tables. When a network packet arrives, nftables checks it against a set of rules to determine a verdict, like accept or drop. Sometimes the rule uses what is called a catch-all element. Think of it as a wildcard. If a packet does not match anything else in the set, the catch-all element decides its fate. But the problem is not in how it filters packets. It is in how the kernel cleans up memory when you delete these rules. When a verdict map is deleted, the kernel deactivates the catch-all elements and decreases a reference counter. If an error happens during deletion, the kernel is supposed to reverse the process and increase the counter back up so the memory is not freed prematurely. Here is where that single errant exclamation mark comes in. It inverted a logic check. Because of this typo, an attacker can manipulate the error handling process to decrease the reference counter an arbitrary number of times. The kernel thinks the object is no longer needed and frees the memory, even though other parts of the system are still pointing to it. This is a classic use after free. Now, a use after free in the kernel is bad. But how does an attacker actually reach it? They need a way to interact with the nf_tables subsystem. Normally, you need root privileges to mess with firewall rules. But there is a feature in Linux called unprivileged user namespaces. User namespaces allow an ordinary unprivileged account to act as root inside a private sandbox. This is a core feature used by container engines like Docker and Podman. It lets the container run safely without giving the user actual root access on the host. But because the user is root inside that namespace, they are allowed to configure nf_tables rules for their sandbox. They trigger the bug, corrupt the kernel memory, and hijack the execution flow. Security firm Exodus Intelligence demonstrated this exploit with over 99% reliability on an idle system. They successfully leaked kernel addresses, bypassed memory protections, and dropped a root shell on Debian Bookworm and Ubuntu 24.04 LTS. Fuzzing Labs also reproduced it on RHEL 10. The sandbox is completely broken. So, how do you fix it? The vulnerability was actually patched upstream in February 2026. The fix was literally removing that one exclamation mark. Ubuntu, Debian, Red Hat, and SUSE have all released patched kernel packages. Your primary mitigation is to run your system updates and reboot. If you cannot reboot your production servers immediately, you can mitigate this by restricting unprivileged user namespaces. This cuts off the attacker's path to the vulnerable code. However, keep in mind this might break some container workloads that rely on that feature. This bug lands in the middle of a massive surge of Linux local privilege escalation flaws. In just the last few weeks, we've seen copyfill, dirty frag, and fragnesia. They all share a common theme, an unprivileged foothold turning into full root access on default installations. Security researchers are using AI-assisted tools and patch diffing to find these flaws faster than ever. If you're running multi-tenant servers or public-facing applications, basic hardening and strict namespace controls are no longer optional. They are your only defense until the patches roll out. But the kernel isn't the only thing you need to patch this week. We are seeing a widespread, coordinated release of security updates across almost every major distribution, targeting the core services that keep your infrastructure running. First up is Samba. There are critical updates addressing authentication bypass flaws. Unpatched Samba services have historically been one of the easiest entry points for ransomware campaigns. These vulnerabilities don't care if you're running Alma Linux, Rocky, or Slackware. If your file sharing is exposed, you are at risk. We also have significant cryptographic improvements rolling out for OpenSSL and memory handling fixes for Apache HTTP server and Nginx. These web server bugs can often be triggered just by uploading malformed PDFs or images. Applying these patches will require restarting your backend services. By the way, I just checked our channel analytics and it turns out about 78% of you watching right now aren't subscribed yet. If you've been getting value from these Linux deep dives, hitting that subscribe button is the best free way to support the channel. And make sure you never miss the next one. SUSE is also tackling a massive wave of CVEs across Kubernetes and Podman. If you are running microservices in production, you need to validate your CI pipelines and get these orchestration patches deployed immediately. Before we wrap up, a quick update on the Gogs 0 day. The vendor has remained completely silent. The vulnerability, which carries a critical CVSS score of 9.4, is still active and unpatched after 10 weeks. If you are still running Gogs in your environment, you are operating with a known exploitable remote code execution flaw with no patch in sight. When a vendor goes silent on a critical report for this long, it is time to seriously consider migrating to an actively maintained alternative like Gitty. This week's updates are heavy and they require careful planning to deploy without breaking production. Test your kernel updates in a staging environment first, automate your cloud instances, and do not ignore those core service patches. Every one of them matters. If you found this useful, please hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel grow and make sure you get these security roundups every week. If you want to support the work directly, consider joining as a sudo user or getting root access through the join button below. Thanks for watching and stay secure.